comparative diplomacy and foreign policy. In this course, we're looking at case studies of the diplomatic process, of the foreign policy process that precedes diplomatic activity. And this is something which is very difficult to understand because of the complexities of the world today. And it's also something which is very difficult to theorize because you're trying to theorize a practice which is not understood as a practice. Even diplomats who are professional practitioners of, let us call them the dark arts of diplomacy, sometimes have grave difficulties in understanding and explaining what it is that they do to an outside world. Insofar as diplomatic studies is a branch of the discipline of international relations, it is one of those branches that has always resisted theorization. But international relations itself is a very new discipline. It only really began in 1918, at the end of World War I. And then an eccentric Welsh millionaire called David Davies, inspired by Woodrow Wilson, the American president, who tried to lay down certain principles for international conduct at the Versailles Conference after the end of World War I, established a chair in the name of Woodrow Wilson, and that became the first chair, the first professorship of international relations. Instantly, the discipline became a minefield of discussion about how to theorize international relations. And the upshot really was a division of the discipline into two broad camps, one of which we would call realist. It basically proposed that the world was an entity that proceeded according to statecraft that depended on the projection of power on behalf of state interests. Obviously, the stronger the state, the more power it had to project, the more successful that state would be in international relations. The opposing camp basically were described as utopians, as idealists, but it said nevertheless that it didn't just have to come down to states. International organization, citizen organizations, the idea that there could be non-state actors in international relations that could try to achieve, despite the interests of states, some kind of world peace, some kind of universal understanding, proposed itself as an alternative to the more acerbic, the more cynical, as it were, aspect of international relations that depended on states and the projection of their interests. But foreign policy is very, very much the formulation of exactly that policy that represents state interests. How to do this? And even if it's very difficult to theorize foreign policy formulation, it's very, very difficult at the same time to understand how this policy is formulated. It actually took until the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis involving the Soviet Union and the United States for an American academic called Graham Allison to propose that our ideas of how foreign policy might be formed can be very, very difficult to demonstrate. He proposed three basic models, and the models were a rational actor model. In the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, was it President Kennedy as the rational actor who made this tremendous decision to face up to the Soviets, to put all kinds of things at risk. Many people in the world thought that we were on the brink of a nuclear Armageddon. And would the young president pull it off? Would he blink first? Would the Soviet chairman, Nikita Khrushchev, blink first? But somehow, somewhere in the mix, it seemed that two powerful men, two rational actors, were trying to deploy some kind of right on the edge rationality that might or might not succeed, or might succeed instead in bringing the world to its end. But Graham Allison also proposed that there was an organizational process model. In other words, the president could not act by himself. He had to depend upon his organized ministries, the advisors, the advice that they brought to his war cabinet. What kind of advice would the Department of Defense bring? What kind of advice would the State Department bring? The National Security Advisor, the CIA, etc., etc. How he would bring to bear quite different forms of advice, and how this advice would be formulated in each of these distinct cabinet organizations. What kind of processes would be at work in each one of these separate organizations that would finally bring some kind of advice to the president so he could try to act with all of these different forms of differently organized and gathered advice as a rational actor. And this led to Graham Allison's third model. What if this organizational process was not clean? What if all of these different branches of government argued? What if the Department of Defense and the State Department were very jealous of each other? They had to fight each other to ensure that it was their advice that was heard by the president. What if all of these different organs of government surrounding the president were in constant turmoil and constant conflict? And he called this the governmental politics model. What if the president was simply making a decision based on what was politically suitable for his internal processes, which might not necessarily address the huge external threat that he was facing? What if the formulation of foreign policy was to serve internal needs, placate internal needs, as opposed to addressing external threat? Now, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the answer was probably a combination of all of those three different models. But it means dissecting and analyzing foreign policy formulation is very, very difficult. And of course, the diplomatic practice that then evolves from the formulation of that policy can also be very, very difficult. Diplomatic practice itself is something which is not new. It's very old, in fact. Curiously, if you look at the archives, the portraits of the Elizabethan age, if you look at 15th century England in the days of Shakespeare, in the days of Queen Elizabeth I, then you'll find portraits of the Morocco to London from Morocco, the ambassador from Morocco. And he was there precisely because Elizabeth, after Henry VIII, was isolated from Catholic Europe. England needed allies in other parts of the world and sought allies from the Islamic world. It seems very odd that all of those many hundreds of years ago, 400 to 500 years ago, there should be this cosmopolitan backwards and forwardness in international relations of those days. And in fact, the presence of the Islamic world from these early times of international diplomacy is something which has continued, obviously problematically, right down to the present day. How to govern these kinds of transactions between very different forms of state facing a world in turmoil, those transactions demanded certain rules. And those rules, the rules of international statecraft, the rules of international diplomacy, were very, very long in coming. Really, it took until 1648 to what they call the Peace of Westphalia. Sometimes it's called the Treaty of Westphalia, but really it was a series of treaties that was finally brought into one coherent set of agreements, one coherent set of principles in 1648 among the quarreling parts of Europe. This was after the so-called 30 Years' War. Europe was devastated. This was a 30 Years' War based on religious differences between Catholics and Protestants. What we now know as Germany, and what we now know as parts of the Bohemian region, were all lying in ruins. The differences were so great, and the number of European actors so many, hundreds of ambassadors from hundreds of small states convened themselves in Westphalia to try to hammer out a new form of international relations. And it was this new form of international relations that finally, after much discussion and argument at Westphalia, drove the international system forward into something that resembles what we have today, and which has come under challenge very recently. But the core of the agreement of Westphalia was that the international system should be secular, not religious. So the religious wars of the past, the international religious wars of the past, would be a thing of history. Obviously, That is a concept under challenge today with the rise of organizations such as Islamic State, for instance. But the sovereignty of states would also be respected. In other words, each state began the process of assuming within international relations a legal personality which gave it certain rights and a certain protected status. This again has been honored more in the breach than anything else. Napoleon, World War I, World War II, all of these occasions threatened the integrity of states. States coalesced into larger entities. They divided as late as the 20th century with Yugoslavia, for instance, into smaller entities. So states waxed and waned, but the idea of recognizing a state, and once recognized, that state having a legal personality that was inviolate and having a sovereignty which it could maintain on its own, by itself, according to its own form, its own system of government, that was one of the heritages of the Westphalian system. But what it meant was that with all of these independent states, with all of their internal forms of integrity, all kinds of difficulty in international relations, which made diplomacy all the more important. How do you transact relationships between states that have their own personality, their own institutions, their own interests, and their own policies towards their neighbors? And this is where the idea of some kind of way of avoiding simply a clash of opposing interests entered into diplomacy. The ultimate clash of interests was seen really in World War I. No one had predicted World War I would start, and certainly no one predicted that it would occur in such a savage way. The technology that had developed by then wiped out so many millions of young people and innocent civilians in World War I that the carnage was something that the world vowed to overcome. Leading the way was the American President Woodrow Wilson, who wanted to put an end to secret diplomacy. He wanted the beginnings of a public, international, multilateral diplomacy, and he wanted principles upon which peace could be built. This was very controversial. His own Congress refused to give him a proper majority, so that the treaties that he proposed were not in fact ratified by the US itself, but it meant the beginnings of an international organization which now sits alongside established states as part of what we might still loosely call the Westphalian system. How this advances, what theories grow out of this, what kinds of forms of international and national security can be derived from this, still leads to principles that clash, by which means that the study of international diplomacy, the study of foreign policy formulation, is more fascinating today than ever it was.